Okay, so we're going to get started with exercise 121. And today what we're going to work on is the elevations of your cabin. And I think one of the important things to understand is that when we're working on the computer, we can look at drawing in the sense of flat drawings like this, where we have a plan and then we fold out an elevation from that drawing, or we could create a 3D model. And the tendency in this day and age is to jump right into SketchUp or jump right into Rhino, build a 3D model, and discover what the elevation looks like after the fact. After you've extruded the walls, suddenly you have an elevation and that's what the building looks like. We're going to approach it slightly differently today in that we're going to draw the elevation in a flat context. This is the way that you used to draw elevations, like back in the day when you used the drafting table. This was when I was in school as an undergrad at your age. This is what we had to do by hand on the drafting table. And so we're going to create these elevations by hand, but learning this method isn't necessarily a bad thing. Chances are you've already studied this in 130. And you've gone through the top view, front view, right side view relationship. We're going to work through the same general context here with our building today, but I want to add a few AutoCAD wrinkles to this. We'll talk about layers today, but we'll also talk about creating guides and construction lines that will not print, but that can really help you in this process. So we're going to start with drawing the south elevation. This is oriented north, south, east, west, so down is south. So looking, if I was standing right here, looking this way, that would be the direction of my south elevation. That would be what I'd be drawing for my south elevation. And so we're going to start with that. But before we actually start drawing the south elevation, we're going to go into our layer properties and establish some layers for today's work. So I'm going to click on Layer Properties, and that will bring up this Layer Properties Manager. And you saw before, last class, we did a wall, a furniture, etc. The next thing that we're going to work on today is going to be our elevation views. And you see that I already have a few elevation views. Do we have a cricket in here? Apparently we have a cricket. It's a very noisy cricket. Anyway, we will continue with the cricket chirping in the background. And I'm going to create a brand new layer. And this brand new layer, I'm going to call South Elevation. Now, we could also call it A-South Elevation if we wanted to, but I'll just stick with South Elevation for right now. I'm going to double-click on it and make sure that it is the current layer there. And I could adjust the color so that I knew I was drawing on the South Elevation layer. For example, I could draw this in blue. Let me draw it in cyan here. And then we would know that we'd be drawing on the south elevation. I'll leave that for today's demonstration purposes. You can leave it white if you want. But the other thing that I want to have, besides the south elevation layer, is a new layer. And I'm going to call this new layer Guides. Or I could call it Construction Lines or something along that line. And on this layer, we'll change the color of this layer to be red. And then over here under Plot, where that little printer icon is, I'm going to click on it so that it has a little red circle next to it saying, nope, it's not going to print. And when we ultimately go to print this, these lines can stay on, but they won't show up in the final print. So I have a guides layer and I have a south elevation layer. In all likelihood, I'm going to start with the guides layer because I'm going to create a few guides first. So let me go ahead and make that the current layer. So now guides is current. And I need to establish my elevation view down here, and I want a few guides that reference my building itself. So I'm going to use a command called ray. And what a ray does is it creates an infinite length line starting at one point. Man, that cricket is loud. Maybe it's not loud for you, but it's like chirping in my ear right now. We're going to create an infinite line that starts at one point and goes off to infinity in one direction. And it works perfectly as a guide. You can access the ray tool under the draw menu. It's right here. It's a dot with a line and an arrow on it. But you can also just type ray into the command line. Either way works just fine. And I'm going to create a ray that starts at this corner. And so I'll click at this corner and I'll go straight down. And when I go straight down and hit enter, it creates an infinite line. No matter how far I zoom out, that line still exists. It just goes off into infinity. So it's a perfect guideline. Let me zoom in, and I'm going to create a ray on the other corner of the building. So I can type ray again, enter, and we'll start at this corner of the building, and we'll go off into infinity there. So now I have the two outer corners of the building. It would be helpful, because I have this inset portion here, to have one coming off this corner and one coming off that corner as well. So once again, I will go to ray, and we'll go off there, and we will go off there as well. So now I have 4 lines coming down that represent kind of the major corners of my building. And now I need a line that goes horizontally somewhere to start the base of my elevation. And so this time, instead of a ray, I'm going to use something called an X line, or a construction line. It's right next to the ray tool, and it's a dot in the center with 2 arrows going off of it. And essentially, that's a double-sided ray. It goes off into infinity in both directions. So I can either type X line, or I can click on the construction line tool. And it doesn't really matter where I... OK, so we're going to give this another shot. I think I'm pretty much back to where I started. I'm going to have to recreate those rays extending down. So once again, I'll use the ray command, maybe. And I'll draw those off of the 4 primary corners of the building. And then I'm going to use that construction line, or X line, to create a line that goes in infinite directions horizontally. So there you can see it going in infinite directions horizontally. Oh, it looks like the red's pretty hard for you guys to see. Let me change that color from red to something easier for you to see. Let's try yellow. Yeah, you guys can see yellow a little bit easier. OK, so now I have guides coming down on each of the primary corners of my building. I have a line that's temporarily representing kind of the ground or floor level. So now it's time to start actually drawing. So I'm going to switch my layer from guides to being on my south elevation layer. And again, I left it as this cyan color just so you guys can see it a little bit better in contrast to the white. And now it's time to actually start drawing my building. So if I start with a line that goes from this intersection to that intersection, and you guys see it as white, not cyan, so go figure. If I start there, I can start building up what I want my building to look like. Now, I have to have some vision in my head of what this looks like in 3 dimensions. How tall is a particular wall, ceiling? Does it have a sloping roof? Does it not have a sloping roof? And that's one of the challenges that you as a designer have to kind of figure out. And like I said earlier in lecture, this is the kind of thing that we tend to rely on 3D programs for now. You don't have to envision what the roof is going to look like. You don't even have to construct where the hips and valleys match. You just model it out and see what the elevation looks like. But in the context of today, we're going to have to actually kind of think through this. Now, the building that I have kind of envisioned here has a flat roof, so it's relatively easy to draw. But it has 3 different building heights. So if I start with a line on this edge, this is the taller section of the building. And I'm going to imagine that at about 16 feet. And I'll come across, and I'll come back down. And this I had envisioned as a little bit shorter. So if I started here, and I went up maybe 12 feet, and then across, and then back down. And I had the line that connects these 2 sections of buildings to be a little bit shorter still, so maybe at 10 feet. So we'll go up to maybe 10 feet, and then we'll go across like that. And so if I were to turn off the guides layer altogether, we can see that I've started drawing kind of the basis for my building. I have a couple things. One, I established this at the floor level, but really if you look at a building, there's always some building below the floor level. When you go home to your house and look at it, there's a foundation below your building. If you step into a doorway, it's very rare that it's perfectly level. Generally, you step up into a particular building. And so we'll have to deal with that in a little bit, and I'll get to that. But before I do that, I'm going to turn back on my guides, and I need to start drawing the other elements that kind of represent this building. So in the kitchen section over here, I have some windows that are established. So I'm going to go ahead and try to draw those in. I will switch my layers back to the guides layer, and I'll use ray again to draw lines that represent each of these windows. Something like that. Now I could go through and I could do rays for every one of these windows, but I know that these 5 windows are all identical to each other. So it would be easier and smarter for me to draw one of the windows and then copy them rather than draw each of them. So I'm going to leave just one set of rays coming down here. And then I need to establish where the horizontal pieces of these windows are. How far off the ground are they? Well, they're above counter height. A counter is 36 inches. So they'd be above that, so maybe 42 inches to start. So I can go ahead and use my construction line. I could also use a ray, either one. And we'll start that construction line up 42 inches from the ground, like that. And like I said, this is a very tall building, so maybe I want tall windows. So from the window, maybe I'll have 6-foot high windows, and that gives me the top of my window. And so I've done all of those as construction lines. If we were drafting, these would be just light lines. And now it's time to add some detail to them. So I will switch from my guides layer to my south elevation layer, and then we'll go ahead and start to draw. So I can use a rectangle here, and I can draw the outline of this window like that. Then I could use maybe offset, distance of maybe 1 inch, and I could put a little frame on the window. To make this a little easier for you to see, let me turn off the guides layer. And now you can see that I have that window laid out. Now maybe it has some breaks to it. So maybe I'll do, I don't know, let's go up 4 feet. And then let me offset that by the 1 inch is fine again. Something like that. So it has a little break to it. Maybe something like that. Now, as I said before, I have multiple versions of this window that are all parallel to one another. So I have a couple different ways that I can do it. Obviously, I could turn back on my guides, and I could draw this same thing next to it using the same method. But I could also take this window, recognize that it corresponds up here in plan to that window, and I could just copy it from this edge to each of these windows. So I can go across there, there, and there, and I end up with copies of the same window. So it's a little bit more efficient to do something in that manner. So there's all of the windows on that side. Now if I come over here, I've got kind of an overhang that's extending. So I need a few more rays to help me out. So let me turn back on my guides. Oh, excuse me. Let me make the guides layer active. And then let me use ray to identify this little end wall and that little end wall. And so I know I'm going to have vertical lines on either side, but I also have a thickness of the roof. So I need maybe a foot down to represent the thickness of the roof, something like that. So now I can go ahead and I could draw in, I think I'm going to change my south elevation layer to be a different color so it's easier for you to see, because it just looks white. See if magenta makes it a little easier. Yeah, now you can see it a little bit better. Yeah, that works. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw in at least the inner part of this wall. So I'll use a polyline here, and we'll go there to there, over, and back down. And if I were to turn off the guides layer, oh, I made a mistake. That should have been on the south elevation layer. Let me change to the south elevation. Let me turn off guides. And we can see that I'm starting to create, there's the elevation for this side. This side has that little recess, so that exists there. Now I need to draw the windows for this side. So I'll turn back on my guides, and I'll use ray to specify the divisions between these windows. So there's one. There's the second. There's one. Second. And now if I came down here, I could draw in using the south elevation. There. Oops. Those should be on the guides layer. Now I could draw the vertical divisions between the windows. So we could come down there. We could go right there. And go right there. And we can go right there. So if I were now to turn off the guides layer, we can see that I have a division between the windows. There's probably a little bit more to it. There's probably window frames and that sort of thing. So let me keep going a bit. I'm just going to draw this window pane, and then I'll copy it the other places. So let's go ahead and let's assume that there's going to be a window frame. So let me use an offset, and we'll do a 1 inch again. And we'll offset each side of the window. We need a line that goes 1 inch up here and across. I'm going to use my fillet with a radius of 0 to connect this and that, and this and that. And then I could use offset, maybe 2 feet, to create a little lower pane there. We'll offset by 1 inch. Oops. Create that part, and then let's take this and let's copy it. I don't know, at maybe 6 feet, and then 12 feet, something like that. I don't really like that. Let's move this down. Move. Yeah, something like that might look good. I still need that top piece, so we'll draw one more little detail here. 1 inch. And I'll use fillet again with a radius of 0 to connect that piece to that piece. So I've just drawn in the windows on this wall. Now I need to copy it over a few more times. So let's take, I'm actually going to delete this, and we will take the window right there. And just as I did before, I will copy it to these other locations there and there. And I need one more version of it right there. And suddenly I have this wall established. So I'm using copy and paste to kind of draw out what that would be. This wall is meant to be a glass, all glass. Okay? So then I end up with the last little piece of this elevation. It looks like I have a few little sliding doors here, or sliding windows. I need to be able to draw those in place as well, but there's also a column that comes down. So let me turn back on my guides, and I will type ray. Oh wait, let me switch my active layer to the guides layer, and then I will type ray and identify this column. Whoops. That was a mistake. Oops. Ray again. Right there. And so that then divides this. We'll switch into my south elevation. And I think this time I'm going to come down from this a foot. Let's go from here. Go across. We'll set up my column from there to there. And now if I were to turn off my guides, we can start to see I'm building up that piece of the building as well. So in all reality, this probably has a a sliding, some kind of a sliding door. I can draw that in place here as well. Let me go ahead and I'm going to draw just a single line there. Actually, let me draw it a couple inches up from the bottom. We'll go up maybe 6 inches and across. We'll go maybe down 6 inches and across. We'll put a line in the middle there. And then we need to do some offsets for the window panels themselves. So let's say offset of maybe 4 inches. Like that. And let's move these over by 2 inches. There we go, because they would overlap. And then let me do a fillet of those two. Repeat fillet, there, there. And I'll repeat fillet one more time, there and there. But since these guys overlap, this would go up high, this would go down, and then we would trim that and that so that they look like sliding doors. So I have those drawn. I can just take them and I can copy them over. So let's take the door here, and I'm going to copy from that point to that point, and now I have those doors. I could mirror them too, depending on which way they were to slide. So I've gone through using the guides, which is here, to build myself out guides. Notice I didn't draw all the guides at once. I drew a few guides, then I started drawing the outline of the building elevation. Then I drew a few more guides for a couple of the windows, and I drew the window. Then I drew a few more guides. If you go through, the temptation is, oh, I'm doing guides, let me just do guides everywhere. If you do that, it's really hard to determine which guide does what. And it's much easier if you don't do it that way and you do it a little bit at a time. And you can leave the guides layer in place after the fact because, again, it's not going to be a printing layer. So I've done a lot to establish this, this elevation, but I haven't yet dealt with what happens below the building. Okay, remember, there's always a little bit below the floor of the building. And I think it would be safe to say minimum 18 inches or so. Okay, 1'6". So in the most simple terms, all I would need to do is, remember I'm on the south elevation here, all I would need to do is offset this down by 18 inches. So we'll say offset 18 inches there. Make it a little bit longer than the building on either side. And then take the walls and extend them down to meet the ground. And if I turned off the guides layer here, we could now see what's happening in the building itself. Now in reality, this line that represented the floor of the building, unless there's a door where I can see the floor of the building, it wouldn't exist. So for example, this would get shorter to there, and this would just come all the way down on the outside of the building. This we would see because there was a little lip. Likewise, we'd see over here there's a little lip. So we'd still see the floor in those two places. And so now I have a drawing that looks reasonable from an elevation standpoint. I would, however, like to enhance it a bit by adding some line weights. And so thus far, everything's on the south elevation layer, and they're fine at the default line weight. But in reality, I probably want to differentiate the windows from the walls a little bit. So you have two different ways of doing this. You could create a south elevation dash windows, or SE dash windows, or something along those lines, and assign it by layer, or you could go in and manually assign all the windows to be a specific thickness. So it's kind of up to you. I'll go ahead and do a new layer, and I'm going to add it and call it south elevation dash windows. And so that I can see the change happen, I'm going to go ahead and make it black. If I can find black, there it is. And we'll change the line weight to be 0.00. And now I have a south elevation windows layer. So now it's just a matter of going through and selecting all of the windows. So we'll take this. There. And I'm going to go ahead and use the doors on the same Windows layer because they're essentially the same thing in an elevation view. So let's go ahead and take all of those. There we go. And all of those I'm going to move onto the south elevation Windows layer. And I can confirm that it happened because they're going to turn white instead of being pink. So that's why I changed the colors as I did it. So now let's go ahead and do a few other things. The baseline here is always going to be thicker. So whatever the ground is always going to be thicker. And so I can manually override the thickness by going up into the properties here and saying, let's make it maybe, I don't know, 0.7. 1, something like that. So it's a thick line. The ground line is always thick. Let me also go in and on south elevation, let's change the color back to black. By the way, when you're picking the color, don't pick this white because that is actually a very, very light gray. Pick this color in the upper row of colors. That is color 7. That is true black, even though it's white. I know. You'll see it when you go to print it. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And there, I will also change the default line weight. We'll go to maybe 0.35. And now you can see that parts of it pop out a little bit, but the windows themselves are nice and light lines. So now I've created the elevation for one side of my building. The ground is actually a little bit more complicated than a straight line in reality. Remember, this building was on a slope. So there's a way of constructing what that slope is, and I'll show you that in just a second for those of you that are more advanced and want to learn that piece. If you just get a flat line, we'll be OK with that too. Okay? So I'll come back and I'll show you actually how to create the slope if you want to. So the next piece of the puzzle is you need to draw the elevation for the rest of the north, south, east, and west. Right? We've already done south. We need the north, which would be up here. The north, south, east would be this side, and west would be this side. So we have a couple different ways of kind of working through this. And depending on how your mind and your brain works, one way will be easier than another. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to the guides layer and turn it on. And I'm going to draw a box around my entire building so that it completely contains my building. And this is called a bounding box. And to do that, I'll click on the rectangle tool here. And I'll start in this corner because there's nothing lower than that corner. And as I start to draw this, oh, sorry, I should be on the guides layer. And as I start to draw this, I want to make sure that I completely contain all of my objects. So this is the highest most point coming across. And this point over here is as far to the left as I can get. So when I draw the box, that then represents a bounding box that goes all the way around my building. Does that kind of make sense? It's a box that goes all the way around. And it completely contains my building itself. So with that drawn, I can now use that as kind of a guide to create the other elevations. And so as you remember, hopefully, in 130, there's a relationship between each elevation as you go around the building. And if we create a 45-degree reflecting line, we can pull elevation heights around to this side of the building. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a ray. So I'll type ray. My start point is going to be this corner of the bounding box. And instead of picking just straight across, I'm going to hit the tab key. And you see I have specify through point. There's a number, but then next to it there's a number for an angle. And so when I hit tab again, I now get into the angle. And so I can type -45, and then I can press tab. And it will now lock me into drawing only at a 45-degree angle. I have to do it again. So, all right, -45. And if I were to click, oh, come on. negative 45 there. And of course it's not doing it. It's not doing it because I'm set in ortho mode. Let's try that again. Negative 45. There it is. I'm in that line. I'll click, and that then creates a 45-degree line from that corner. I can then use the elevations that I've created to pull and draw the building on the right here. And so for me, having had lots of practice, I can draw an elevation sideways or even upside down, and it doesn't make any difference because my brain flips it around and I've been comfortable drawing it. For some of you, that will be too challenging to try to think of it on its side and to stare at it this way or what have you. In which case, you can do a rotate of everything and get to the same place. So let me continue a little bit more to set this up. This was my ground. I want to continue my ground. So let me do an X line or a construction line that is even. Let me turn back on ortho here. That is even with my ground. That creates an intersection point right there. That is then going to be the ground for my elevation on the side. So I'll once again type X line, and I'll go in that direction. So where those two intersect is the ground, and I can start to draw my elevation view based on that ground. If you want to rotate everything so that you can see it upright instead of having to do it on the side, you want to rotate around that intersection point as you do the rotation. And I'll show you that in just a second. Okay? The other thing that can happen is sometimes the guides get a little too heavy. There's too many guides. You can go through and you can delete guides, or you can come back to your layer properties and create a new layer called Guides 2. And sometimes doing it that way can be really helpful. Turn off Guides 1. Well, actually, I have to move a few layers. Let me move this diagonal, this line, and this line to Guides 2. And then we'll go ahead and turn off Guides 1. And suddenly it's a little cleaner again, and you can start fresh. You can change the color of the different guides. It's really up to you. So across this 45-degree line, right, I can start to draw on the side here. So let me go ahead and do array. And we'll start, just like I did before, with the major corners of the building. There's one. There's the second one. And now I need the height of this building, or this piece of the building. So I can pull that right there to the 45-degree line right here, going up. And I've now created the box that represents the outer part of my building. So then I can switch back, and you could create a new layer. I have south elevation. Let's create a new layer for east elevation. Let's go ahead and make it white. Actually, so you guys can see it, let's make it purple. And we can up the thickness here a little bit. Let me make the east elevation current. And then I can go ahead and draw in the east elevation. I need a ground line that's a little thicker than everything else. So let's take this. And I did it at, I think, 0.7. There. So now I've created that edge. Now, this edge of my building doesn't have any windows in it, and I probably should have a few windows, and therefore I would draw it. But in my case, I don't have it. But you can see that I use these lines to create that view of the elevation. The alternative, if looking at it on its side is too challenging, would be to make sure that you take everything. You have to make sure everything's unlocked, too. So my topography layer needs to be unlocked. Some of you locked it in the beginning. Make sure it's all unlocked. Then you can take, assuming everything is on, so all my layers are on and unlocked, I can take all of it, and I can then rotate from that point. This is a negative 90-degree rotation. And then I could draw that there. When I'm done, I would rotate all 90 degrees from that point again. And we be back to the start. So making those rotations, if it helps you mentally, go ahead and do the rotations. The challenge here is that you have to ultimately either you keep rotating by negative 90 degrees, draw each elevation, and then you end up in the correct orientation again, or you have to rotate backwards to get into the correct orientation. Otherwise, you can, of course, just draw it to the side or upside down or backwards. We're going to leave these in their positions folded out from all the elevations, and I'm going to show you how to reorient them on a paper space model later on. So the goal today is to be able to create each of the elevation views, north, south, east, and west, of your plan. Next class, we'll talk about how do you get them from this state into something that is a nice printable document. So we're still moving forward. So today you're going to work on your elevations. I did tell you that I would show you how to deal with the slope of the ground for those of you that wanted to do this. If you feel overwhelmed, you can shut me out now. But if you don't, I want to at least talk about how you would go about doing this. So in this view, let me turn off the east elevation. And let me turn off the guides 2 layer. I have to make my south elevation active there. Let me turn off guides east elevation. There we go. When we look at this particular building, we have the topography lines that go through my building. Now I've trimmed those topography lines out so that they don't actually pass through my building, and you can do that as well. But as we look at these topography lines, we know that the interval between these is 1 foot, and it's sloping up from this being lower to this being higher. So the elevation view is taken along this plane right there. So that's the elevation view. So where this line meets topography, we know that it slopes upwards. So if I let me create a new layer for this. Let's turn off the guides 1 layer. I'm going to create a new layer called Topo Guides for clarity. And we'll make this, I'll make it red so you can see it. I'll make it active. Turn it on. Make it active. Oh, come on. There we go. And let me make sure that that line is on the Topo Guides layer. There we go. So that's our elevation view. That's the plane that we took our elevation in. So wherever it intersects one of these topo lines, I'm going to create a ray. So I'll type ray, and I'll draw down from there. And you need a few of these for it to really work. So I'm going to go off in both directions a bit to find at least 4 intersections. So there's the 4 intersections. So I know that at each one of these points, we're going up by 1 foot. So if I were to create an X line, and I'm just doing it somewhere down here, that went across, and I did an offset of this line by 1 foot, like that, I can use this to create the slope. So I would start at this point, and I'm going to use a tool called a spline. It's right here. And I would start right there at that lowest point. I'd move over and go up 1 level to that point. I'd move over and go up 2 levels to that point. And I'd move over and go up 3 levels to that point. This line, which I will change to be on the south elevation layer, now has the slope of the ground to it. So I created the slope of the ground, and now it's just a matter of pulling this up and go to move. And we can pull this up to match up with the slope of my building itself. So in this case, there's the correct slope rather than being flat. So we'll take this line away. There's my slope. And maybe I don't want it to be more than 18 inches, so I could move it up a little bit higher, something like that. And I could do a trim off of those pieces. So let's do trim. And we'll get rid of the little extras like that. And yes, this is significantly longer than I really need, but it is the correct slope. It matches the actual terrain. So this part, getting the slope correct, is totally optional. You can just have a flat slope. That's OK. But for those of you that are advanced, that feel comfortable in AutoCAD, go ahead and go through this so that you learn how to construct what that slope would be. And this, again, should be much thicker. So we'll do it at 0.70. And that then represents this elevation view. Okay? So I know it's a lot to try to draw 4 elevations in one day. But at the same time, we have to keep moving forward. The class is only so long. I expect a lot of work to be done today. If you haven't finished your floor plan, you're behind. So you need to have that resolved, and you need to get on with your elevation views. You may find today that some of the things that you thought were resolved in your plan are no longer resolved now that you're doing an elevation, and you may need to make some changes. That's perfectly OK. All right? So why don't you guys get started? If you have questions, let me know, and I'm happy to help.